Okay. Hi, I am Kisha Bertrand. I am a lead UX writer at Huge, and today I'm going to give a presentation on the importance of UX writing in the design process. So we'll go ahead and get started. So here's just a little bit about me, just so we can get to know each other. Like I said, I'm Kisha. I am a writing lead at Huge. I have been working in, I've been a copywriter and a writer for about 15 years now, working in various industries. I really love collaborative brain power. I love collective brainstorms and just people coming together and really putting their minds together to make something great. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to give this talk today. I am very passionate about people. I love to learn, and so I'm just excited to record this and share some of my knowledge. I currently am working with Google at Huge, and I have worked with different brands like Kiss and American Girl, The Walking Dead, all of those things. So a little bit more about me, just so we can still get to know one another. My favorite things are my two kitties, Nona and Artemis. Artemis is a sightless kitty. I found her on a sidewalk at 10 weeks old, and she has taught me a lot about accessibility and through the framework of a cat, which is not what I was expecting, but it's been great. So I love them. And then I have my meditation. I love mindfulness and stillness and just really like connecting with myself in that way. I enjoy being outdoors. I like going on walks and hikes and morning runs. I also love to dance. I love to move. So I'm at a stand-up desk because sometimes I just can't stop moving. So I got to get it out. So that'll probably happen a lot as I'm going through this. And then I also enjoy creativity, just creative expression, art, performance art. And so those pictures at the bottom right are just some that I took at Burning Man a few years back. And yes, I was there this year, and I'm happy to talk about it if anybody wants to message me. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. We will go ahead and get into the presentation. So here is just a high level view of what we are going to talk about today, or what I'm going to talk about. And that's the role of UX writer, the process, how we fit into that, the deliverables that we give in that process. And then I'm going to wrap things up. So we'll go ahead and start. So first with the role. So who or what is a UX writer anyway? A lot of people ask, what is it that you do? Like, what is a UX writer? What does UX mean even, And so today I'm going to break it down and let you all know. I will say that a lot of times, the role sounds different at different organizations. It might be called content designer somewhere. It might be called UX copywriter at another place. As the role just defines and grows, we're seeing a bunch of variations on what it's called, but it's ultimately the same thing that all of those people are doing. It just really varies on the organization and some of the different skills that you're asked to do, but it's basically the same thing. So let's break that down and see what that looks like. So a UX writer, we work on a lot of different things, first of all. We're working on conversational UI, we're working on mobile applications, we're working on websites, dynamic interfaces, and also voice and tone guides and all of those things. So it's a mix of a bunch of different elements that make up the role. So let's dive into exactly what that looks like. So there are two parts to that role, UX writer. The first part is UX. And that means that we're responsible for content narrative, we're responsible for hierarchy, we're responsible for grouping information architecture and structure, and just really telling the story from the framework of the page, and then also the product, and then also from a storytelling lens. The second part is obviously writer. So that's when you're looking into the more traditional like form of the role, where we're looking at voice and tone, we're looking at subject matter, we're looking at consistency and clarity and accuracy. You know, some of the things that I'm charged to do at when I'm working with Google is looking through some of the sites and making sure that we're using the same Wi-Fi everywhere. Is it all caps Wi-Fi? Is it capital W lowercase I, capital F lowercase I? You know, those sorts of things. We just have to be knowledged in and keep that in the back pocket. So essentially, UX writers, you know, we help brands tell stories through digital experiences. And that could be, like I said, websites, it could be mobile first applications, it could just be like physical experiences, as well as digital. So how do we do that exactly? Well, we're going to get into the process now. So here's essentially a timeline that you would mostly see, excuse me, that you would see mostly in a project. You have your brief, you know, where the stakeholder, the client comes and they tell you what they're looking to do, and they're wondering how you can help them. And then from that, you go into wireframing. And most of the time you have UX or regular normal writers come in at the visual design, and then they'll leave at visual design. And then you have development. I like to call that moment Lorem Ipsum Island. I'm sitting, the writer's silo, right? I'm sitting on my little island, and you know, a designer gets in their rowboat and they come out to me and they're like, yeah, I got this content that I need filled in. Here's some Lorem Ipsum, like, show me what you got. And I'm just kind of sitting here like, well, all right, sure. Let me fill that in for you with no context on where it came from, why it's structured the way it is, just being required to fill in the blanks without really knowing why. And so that basically means that all of that stuff was done before I even had a chance to weigh in. That system was already created by a strategist, by a designer, whomever, and so I have to fit within the confines of that system. And that's challenging to do, and it really gives a disservice to, you know, the product, the team itself, and you know, and most importantly, the final person that's going to be reading this, like the user. You know, we're not really benefiting or taking advantage of the full capabilities of that writer that could really help with figuring those things out before it got to just that confinement. So, which leads me to a normal project for UX writers. Like this is my jam right here. Like we're starting at brief. You know, we're coming in and we're asking questions at that brief stage, because you have to have somebody to advocate for the story and for the words. And if you don't have a writer in the room, maybe the content strategist, maybe somebody who's in design that's kind of thinking about what that would look like in a visual sense. But you need that storytelling perspective. And so, you know, we're there from the brief, we're there in wireframing, we're there in visual design, and then we're there like toward a development handoff, you know, right up to that point. So essentially, you know, we're responsible for helping to lay a strategic foundation in writing to that, and making sure that that story is properly communicated through language and design. Like I said, you have to have somebody in the room that's going to advocate for that part of this. And while everybody, I'm sure, is thinking that that's important, they're not thinking of it in a framework with the lens from a storyteller. And so it's very important that we make sure that UX designers are involved as early as possible. And so what that means is, you know, working with UX designers, working with visual designers, working with strategists and developers. One of my favorite things in this process is working directly with UX designers and strategists. You know, I'm in the trenches with them when they're building out these frameworks for products and design. And so, you know, I get to have an input in how we should like structure the hierarchy. What type of components should we use? Do we have enough content that'll fill a 2-up, or you know, do we need to think about like lessening the content because we've got a 4-up's worth but we need a 2-up's worth? Those sorts of things are so important, and that way you're not constraining the design or the writer, the story. And so visual designers, you know, I also love working with them because obviously, you know, you've got visual components that go along with the story, with the words that you're expressing, and it's so important to align there. I can think of an example actually when I was working on a Google product. I think it was for Google Home, and it was talking about voice activation and voice assistant, hands-free, Google Assistant, just use your voice. And so I wrote all the copy for that, really telling the story about how you could utilize, Google Assistant hands-free. And what the picture was that they decided to use with that copy was somebody holding a tablet, like a big tablet with just two hands, just like almost like this, essentially, in that frame. And so I'm thinking, okay, we're talking about something hands-free, and the first thing that I'm seeing is somebody using their hands. Maybe we can rethink this imagery. And I kind of had to battle with them a little bit because, they kind of had a vision of where they were trying to go, like visually, but ultimately we needed to focus on the feature. I can't rename the feature. I can't call it foot first, foot first assistant or ear first assistant. It's hands free. And so ultimately, like, we landed to a consensus. Yeah. And we found a photo that worked, but it's just things like that you need to make sure that somebody is there to advocate for those words and the way you're telling that story, especially when it comes to like it actually being a part of a feature. So we also work with strategists, trying to figure out exactly how we can keep the strategy of the product or the page, but also still make it relatable to the person that, is reading that information. So if we're talking about, privacy or safety, we don't necessarily want to sound like ADT on a page that's, or, a security system handbook on a page that's meant for people to just understand. And so how much can we like wiggle that as far as how we're talking about different things, and is it meeting the brand strategy that you laid out? It's really important to kind of like talk through that. Sometimes these roles overlap. Sometimes you have UX writers that do a little bit of strategy because you might not have a strategist on that role. It's really great to just kind of beef up your UX writers in case you could utilize one of them for, strategy purposes. Like, it's great because everybody's learning at the end of the day. And then developers, we are usually like touched on by developers to come up with image alt text sometimes to figure, and I'll get into that later. But then also making sure that the words that we are producing and the things that we're telling people to do are actually doing the things that we need them to do. If I have a button that says explore options, I want to make sure that when people click on that button, they're going to be taken to a page of options, maybe not a field submission form or something that just doesn't reflect what those words are trying to say. So, we need to be in the room for that as well, just to make sure that everything works and everything makes sense with the interactions. So essentially, UX writers need to be involved in everything, from asking questions in that brief from a storytelling perspective, to helping out with frame or wireframes, to, helping with that final QA. So, okay, cool. We know how UX writers are woven into the process, but what are some of these deliverables? How does that look? So let's get into that. I'm gonna drink some water. Delicious H2O. Okay. So first, we're starting with content narrative. And so a content narrative is basically a short story. It's like, think wireframes for the words, for the story. We want to make sure that we're separating the bones, the message from the copy, from the style, right? So just like how a UX designer would, create a low fidelity wireframe with a bunch of like gray boxes, the goal of that is just to lay out how the product or the page would function, without distracting with, colors and imagery and photos. And so it's the same thing, but it's just for the words. So we usually will create those at this part of the process, usually in tandem with wireframing. And this is why I love working with UX designers, because you could really create like amazing things together as far as telling essentially the same story, but they're doing it from an interaction standpoint and we're doing it from a storytelling standpoint, but we're still working on the same thing. And so, you know, we're building out those wireframes essentially in tandem and sometimes together. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like in a little bit. But first, let's dive into what content narratives are a little bit further. It basically establishes a fixed subject and moves through the beginning, the middle, and the end of a story. So it's basically like just telling a story, but through wireframes. It's important because it gives design teams guidance on how to create wireframes, how we're telling the story, and then it also helps to align stakeholders. So you can really get them to focus on what that hierarchy looks like, opposed to what that hierarchy is saying. A content narrative is not actual copy. It should never be actual copy because then you're distracting them from like the framework of the story. And we need to make sure that we align on that first before we start actually like writing the copy. We usually deliver that as a content hierarchy with different boxes that I'll show you an example of in just a second. And we work on it with UX writers. We collaborate with strategists and I'm sorry, we're the writers. We work on it with designers. And we also collaborate with strategists just to kind of make sure that everybody's aligned. It's just a great way to internally collaborate, but then also still aligning with your stakeholders. And it's ultimately the UX writer's responsibility to make sure that this is done. And then you usually want to share it, you know, share it with a writing lead, a creative director, a UX lead, get feedback on it, and then share it with your internal team. You know, make sure that everybody's on the same page and agrees with your rationale, and or if they don't agree, you know, have those conversations, and then that way you can feel a little bit more confident moving into writing the actual copy. A lot of the times I have my content narratives on a separate like page, and I'm remembering what that structure is before I go and start spinning off into my own head. Like it's great to have that blueprint. So here's an example of what it looks like. This is an actual content narrative that I developed for a device that Chromebooks was releasing. This was over a year ago. It's out on the market. Actually, fun fact, Google, they have code names for their, Chromebooks specifically. They will use code names to talk about some of the devices internally, just because it's just that protected, that we don't want any of this information to get out before it's supposed to. And so this particular device was called the Crux. This is out, we've released it, so it's okay for me to share this. But essentially, what we're trying to do is establish how we want to talk about this device on this page and what that looks like. What are the things that we need to focus on? So first, we'll have a headline. We'll have, you know, CTA. Do we want a CTA in the hero? Do we want to move people away from the site before they actually move down it, but below the fold? You know, and then you move into your hero features. What are they? What are the things that we want to focus on in this section? You know, what do we consider our hero features? These are conversations that you're having when you're building this narrative. You know, in this particular example, made to move, more ways to get things done, that's almost at the copy level that I was just saying we shouldn't be at this point. The only reason why we've used this here is because these are terms that Google, the stakeholder, brought to us that they wanted to see incorporated on the page. So we wanted to give them an idea of what that could look like, what some of these use cases how they could be presented on the page. And so made to move, you know, like we're wanting them to, you know, have an idea of how you can stay connected, like on the go and still be productive. And, you know, like what are we going to talk about in the productivity like module, or we can talk about the touch screen, the charging stylus. What are the things that we want to get into? And then you talk more about excitement. You know, that's a really big thing with Chromebooks, that you can be productive on them, that you can play on them, you can take them with you. You know, how do we want to talk about each of these things? Where do we want to talk about these things? Learn more obviously is usually toward the bottom, but what do we want them to learn more about? Do we want to put like a Q&A here? Do we want to recap the value props? These are all the conversations that you want to have at this stage. And then that way, moving up in fidelity, you can really connect and collaborate with different people across teams to figure out what the story is going to look like in an interaction and visual perspective. And let me show you what that looks like. Excuse me. This is why I love working with UX designers. This is an actual mid-fidelity wireframe that I worked with a UX designer on for the Chromebook gaming page. Now, this is separate from the PDP that I just shared. That was a product display page. The last content narrative. So this is an actual page that showcases multiple devices. And we really wanted the stakeholders to get an idea of how that story could be told. So on the left side, you'll see all of those boxes, and that was the content narrative that I built for this particular page. And so you see how it's a little bit more bare bones, how it's hero, feature devices, benefits, device features. That's the framework that we all decided on. So once that was established, I worked with the UX designer to talk about how that story is being told. And that's when I started sprinkling in a little bit of that copy, right? Like we had already talked about what we wanted the sections to say. So let's give them a taste of how it could go. And I did that mostly in headlines. At the very start of the component of the module, I wanted them to have a headline and a little bit of a subhead, just so they could see how that story would be told throughout the page. I didn't get into subheads when it came to benefits. I just talked about the benefits in a high perspective in the headlines. So, launch your favorite cloud games, enjoy automatic updates. And then once we get buy-in from that, excuse me, we can then go into what that looks like in the subhead. But then it's also like playing around with the language, like, I just feel myself getting like just butterflies thinking about it, because it's talking to people. Like these are gamers. These are people who are, excited about gaming, but then they're also like thinking about buying a series of computers that were specifically formatted for gaming in the cloud. Chromebook was really excited about this, because there hadn't really been a suite of computers that were specifically built for that purpose. And so, we wanted to get them excited about that. So Marvel in multicolor, smash through gameplay, like really using that emotive language to speak to these users, to really connect with them. Because yes, we're selling computers, and yes, we want them to engage with the site, but we want them to be excited about it. It's fun, like it's meant to be fun. Blast off with immersive audio, warp speed Wi-Fi. I love that term so much. But yeah, and so this was a really great way to kind of give them an idea of, hey, this is what we were thinking as far as how this page could sound. What do you think? I personally, as a writer, I like to push. I like to expand. I like to almost make people feel uncomfortable, because Google does have their ways. They have Chromebooks. Every Google product has a way that they speak about things. And it's easier, I feel, to reel somebody in than it is to like stay confined, like just really push people out of their comfort zone and see what they're thinking. And so, and I love using really emotive language, especially when it comes to different things like this, like just comes to speaking to a consumer about something that's meant to be fun. Play your way on any platform. I obviously love alliteration, if you can't tell. So some questions that you might want to ask yourself at this point is, is the content bucketed in the right order? These are questions that you almost want to ask before you get to that mid-fidelity wireframe in tandem with the UX designer. Is it bucketed properly? Is there content missing? Is it correct? Do we need to add anything? Those are the things that you want to make sure that you're thinking about when you're building these content narratives and ready to present them to your stakeholders. So copy docs is the next deliverable that we're going to get into. all this moving around. I'm telling you, like you get dehydrated. You gotta have my water. All right, copy docs. So when are we creating copy docs? Well, we're moving through that process, right? So now we're at the visual design process or point. We've already gotten the content narrative approved. Everybody feels good about the hierarchy. They're excited about some of that language that you introduced in the mid-fidelity phase. So now we got to get to the nitty-gritty. Now we got to start writing out that subhead copy. We got to start really figuring out what we want to say. So a copy doc is essentially a document where all of that information lives. That's, your SEO data, your headlines, your subheads, your CTAs. You need a place for all of that to go. Yes, you could work directly in Figma, but I think that it's always great to have that North Star, that point where if somebody has a question about the copy, they have a single place where all of it's housed so they could go. That's why we do it. You really want to make sure that there is a place that somebody could go and they don't have to search for like the next round of copy. They know that it's there. This is not a narrative structure. At this point, you should have already solidified what that narrative looks like. This is us just figuring out what it's going to say and how we're telling that story based on that approved narrative. We usually do this through Google Docs. I'm going to show you an example of what the copy doc looks like in a Google Doc form. And usually we work on these alone as writers. Like, I love the collaboration point, but I also like to have that heads down time where you could really think through what you're trying to say. So now we've moved from copywriter Lorem Ipsum Island to like a tree house. Like you're in your own little tree house, but then you've got everybody has a tree house and you can come down from the tree houses and then like sit at the picnic table and figure out like what you want to say. It's just, I'm just a very visual person, it's obvious, but but you also too, like you're working on it alone, but you do still want to collaborate with team members. You want to get their feedback after you've created this. You want to make sure that you're still like getting input. You share that with, a writing lead or a creative director, same thing with the narrative, right? You want to make sure that you're on the right track and get some input before you share it with the rest of the team. You encourage people to read comments and leave their comments and see, what they're thinking and get their thoughts. I personally leave most of it to comment mode. I give people access to leave comments. Sometimes it gets a little messy in there if you give everybody editor access. So that's something that you can think about or talk to your team with, about how that looks. So here is an example of a copy doc. This is an actual one that I formatted for the gaming page that I just showed you, those wires. So you always want to start, obviously, with the name of the deliverable and, the project name. But then I also put my name on it, like old school, like, lined paper, write your name at the top, right? Like, because yeah, you can see who created the doc, you can see who sent it to you, but you want to know like, okay, this is the person that I need to ask questions. This is the custodian of this work, and this is who I go to. And so I think it's just, you have to think about who your user is when you're creating these copy docs as well. We're all busy, I've got visual designers looking at this, UX designers, strategists, and I want to make it easy for them to be able to ask questions, for them to be able to view the information. And that's very important. I'm going to use my mouse for the first time here. And so if you look at the heading and then the subhead, if I were to deliver this as just one big chunk of text, it would be really difficult to understand what this looks like on a website, right? So you have, like your headline here, but then right underneath you have your subhead. And so if you're able to like really view that as like a bold, heading and then like, a light subhead, it makes you be able to like really connect the dots without having to look at that actual visual in some cases. So, we usually break these down in those sections, like you have heading, you have subhead. Sometimes you would have a CTA here. This is also a good place to talk about, disclaimers, if you're going to add those, like, unless you get into superscript, and that's for another talk. But so that is what the copy doc looks like to start. But then you move down and, here is a good place that we have CTAs. You have the CTA copy, And then you also want to include the URL. Like, where's that CTA going? Do you have that established yet? In this case, we didn't. We were still waiting on those PDP pages to link to, but you still want to have a place for that. You still want to remind people that this needs to go somewhere. And so let me go ahead and set up a space for that, even if I don't have that information yet. In some cases, you have your URL and there might be an image right next to it. And so I would put image alt text, a line for that here. And we're going to get into what that is, but this would also be a good place to house that information. It's also a great place to have alternatives to headlines, right? So this, explore accessories to boost your gameplay. This heading is literally on the Chromebooks game page right now. But then here are some other alternatives that they could have considered also. Like make every move count with accessories, just giving some options. And you want to make sure that you indicate what the recommended option is and what the alternatives option are. And so I kind of did this in the same way that I'm displaying the heading and the subhead on the page itself anyway, where I have the heading, the recommended heading, bold, and then I have the alternatives. They're there. I even say that these are alts, but they're grayed out. They're there, but they're not necessarily the thing that I want you to focus on. But here's an option, just in case you're thinking that you want to try something different instead of this heading. So some things that you might want to ask yourself at the copy doc process or the copy doc point is, does this doc align with the narrative that we already, decided on, the content narrative? Does it match the design? Is it clean? I mean, and what I mean by that is if, it's grammatically correct. Are there a whole bunch of comments in there? Have people gone in and made edits? And that's exactly why I try to limit the amount of people who do have access to the copy docs, because sometimes you can have too many cooks in the kitchen. Everybody's giving feedback at once. You need to make sure everybody's aligned. You don't know who to go to. So it can become a bit messy at times. And you want to just make sure that you are accounting for that and that the right people have access to it and they're able to approve it internally. And then also, like external access, like what stakeholders are you giving this to and how many of them are commenting on this and who's the person that you want to refer to for ultimate feedback, those sorts of things just to be aware of. It just really depends on the structure of your organization and the project you're working on, but just take into consideration that sometimes there might be people making a lot of comments and you just need to be able to figure out whose comments need to be applied where. So that brings us to our last deliverable, image alt text, right? I just mentioned that image alt text could be added to a copy doc. That's where everything is housed. I will tell you what image alt text is. And it's basically the text that we write to describe an image, to describe what's happening in that imagery. And that's why that's done at the development stage toward the end, because at this point, we've already established the final copy, we've established the final photos, all of the imagery is already approved. So now we know, okay, this is what's going to be shipped. So this is what we need to make sure that we're writing that image alt text for. And it's usually done at this process because, we're getting into those beginning stages of development. So here are some best practices for image alt text. This image here is actually pulled from the family friendly page on Chromebooks. And you want to make sure that what you're describing in the image is telling the story of what you're saying on the whole page. You want to make sure that you're still contributing to that story for the visually impaired, because that's essentially what these image alt texts are written for. They're for screen readers to call out what's happening in the image. So you want to make sure that you're doing that in roughly 125 characters or less. You could maybe go to 130, but I like to try to keep it between 120 and 125, just in case, you need some extra wiggle room, in case the image changes and you need to add something. That's just what I would suggest. And you also want to avoid assigning gender or race to the people in the photos. You know, like I said, unless it applies to what's happening, the story that you're telling, you don't really need to go into those areas. For example, Google had just done a bunch of work on the Pixel camera, and they had this campaign where it's like true tone, and it was specifically talking about how these cameras had been re-envisioned to really be inclusive to people with darker skin tones. So all of the imagery is just beautiful, like brown and olive and caramel colored skin, people like sitting in the sun. And so you want to focus on the complexion instead of what their race is. Like, talk about what their skin tone and how it's shining because the camera is so great, those sorts of things. And you also don't want to assign gender, instead focus on the stage of life. So in this case, it's obviously a family, or what appears to be a family. You know, instead of saying it's a mom and a dad, you know, say two adults or two parents, even, because this is a family page. So you want to say, you know, parents or older family members or something along those lines to basically say what's happening in the image. Two parents hover over a young, you know, child who's using a Chromebook at the kitchen table, you know, just to like really put in that family friendly element, because that's the story that you're telling on the overall page. You always want to be aware of that when you're writing this. You don't want to be redundant, because you have those sweet 125 characters. Like, you got to utilize them to the best of your ability. So if you write picture of two adults hovered over young child, then you are causing redundancy and you're wasting some of those valuable characters, because the screen reader is going to do that for you. The screen reader does that for the user. You know, they're going through and they're trying to read a page, or have the screen reader read the page for them. And you have to remember that it's going to call out graphic, it's going to call out photo, image, and then it's going to say what that image alt text is. So just keep that in mind, you know, especially like you don't want to like have something say image of parents, da da da. I mean, no. So always think about that, you know, like if you were to write image alt text for this image, like what would it say? What would you think would be the thing to convey within that character limit for that page? And I know it's kind of hard to tell because it's a single image outside of the context of the whole page, but knowing that it's on a family friendly page, knowing that it's on Chromebooks, what do you think would be like the thing to really highlight in this photo? So those are things to think through. Always having empathy for people who may not be able to view this image as clearly as others. You know, just making sure that you are still telling the story from a perspective of a person that you know, might not have the same story experience yourself. And always be aware of those things. So we're getting close to the end, friends. The wrap up. I mean, and basically, you know, long story short, UX writers are pivotal to the process. And I hope that I've been able to really explain that. You know, we're ultimately on one team here. And what you want to do is utilize all of the members of your team to the best of your ability, because we're all trying to achieve one goal, and that's to make intuitive, accessible, and enjoyable products. You want to do that in a way that, you know, is inclusive. You want to make sure that you're hearing everybody's perspective, and you want to make sure that you're utilizing the perspective of your storyteller, you know, a person that lives in words and knows words and can really like add a perspective that you might not have considered in another discipline. And then we'll also like maybe proofread your stuff. Now I'm gonna have a whole bunch of writers come to me like, how dare you say we'll proofread? Like, I can only speak for myself. I actually kind of enjoy it, but you know, like I mean, ultimately we're all on the same team. We're all trying to achieve the same things. So, and that's to make, you know, harmonious human-computer interactions, usable, inclusive, accessible, intuitive products and designs. So just include your writers as soon as you can. And I think that would really be glorious. So that's about it. Thanks so much for listening. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn if you have any questions. And here's my email address. Currently is Halloween, but I look forward to hearing from you. Let me know if you did watch this video, even if it is Halloween here. Now in February, it's still Halloween to me because I'm just this goth person. So drop in a spooky emoji to let me know that you watched this video, and let's talk. And in the meantime, peace, love, respect, and keep designing for everybody.